May 1940, German paratroopers would carry out one of the first missions of its kind. A bold and carefully coordinated assault. Small teams of Fallschirmjäger would glide in to Eben-Emael. This at the time was one of Europe's most heavily fortified buildings pretty much everywhere. And this kind of marked the arrival of a new special force in military history. So the Fallschirmjäger weren't just obviously normal infantry, as you know, pretty much most of you know that by now, but at the time they were kind of being trained for special operations, going behind the lines and kind of doing what they had to do.
The assault on Fort Eben-Emael would be one of the most daring military operations of the Second World War, and it began in near total silence. Carried by glider, the German paratroopers of Assault Detachment Granite were armed with flamethrowers and top-secret explosives, so advanced they had only been tested once, on German fortifications at Gleiwitz. Their objective? Land directly atop a fortress widely believed to be impregnable, then destroy it from the roof down. As the assault teams studied their target, they saw a fortress shaped like a massive diamond, its surface bristling with cupolas, bunkers, and artillery positions. The roof itself measured just 800 by 650 yards, heavily defended with short and long-range guns, pillboxes, and a surrounding 13-foot wall. On one side, a sheer cliff dropped 130 feet into the Albert Canal. To the northwest, terrain could be flooded, forcing any ground attack to wade through mud under fire from bunkers perched on higher ground. Beneath this surface lay a labyrinth of tunnels, connecting command posts, living quarters, ammo stores, and even a power station. The garrison numbered around 2,000 Belgian troops. The team assigned to seize this fortress was small, just 83 men under Oberleutnant Witzig, including glider pilots who would join the fight on foot after landing. Alongside standard explosives, they carried two highly classified shaped charges, a 50-kilogram device that could pierce thick armor, and a smaller 12.5-kilogram variant designed to wreck gun barrels with precision. But this operation was a race against time. German commanders estimated the window of surprise would last no more than 60 minutes. After that, Belgian defenders inside and outside the fort would begin to respond in force. So the plan was bold and simple, hit hard and fast. In just 10 minutes, 600 seconds, the assault troops had to break out of their gliders, locate their targets, plant the charges, and move to secondary objectives before the fuses even finished burning. Their success would depend entirely on months of brutal, intensive training. Once the fort was taken, Witzig's men were to hold it until the arrival of the 151st Infantry Regiment, which would cross the Albert Canal nearby at Caen. Koch's orders to the men were clear: disable the enemy's armoured gun turrets, eliminate resistance, and hold the ground, no matter what. 3 other detachments from Koch's battalion were also in action, targeting the vital bridges over the Albert Canal at Veldverzelt, Vroonhoven, and Caen. These groups, codenamed Steel, Concrete, and Iron, would launch at the same time as Granite. The battalion had been spread across several secure locations in the Rhineland. On the evening of May 9th, they received their orders: full combat readiness. The next message confirmed it. Operation Full Gelb would begin at 5:25 on May 10th. At 4:30 a.m., under cover of darkness, 42 gliders took off from Cologne, carrying 493 elite paratroopers and their officers. Strict radio silence had been ordered. No contact would be made once airborne. The towing aircraft followed a path of fires on the ground, pointing west toward Belgium. But almost immediately, problems arose. 2 tow ropes snapped, one of them carrying Witzig himself and the reserve troops. With no altitude to reach the target zone, both gliders crash-landed back inside Germany. Witzig scrambled for a replacement glider and Tug regrouped his men and raced west again, already behind schedule. Meanwhile, the rest of the gliders were released at 7,000 feet, high enough to silently glide the remaining 20 miles. The towing planes banked away sharply and disappeared into the dawn. The gliders dipped, corrected into a controlled dive, and approached the canal. Then they plunged, steep and fast, into the heart of the fortress. It was just before first light. The black gliders, shrouded in morning mist, swooped onto the roof of Eben-Emael one after another. A Belgian sentry manning an anti-aircraft battery, Objective 29, spotted them and opened fire as the gliders skidded across the grass. But the first assault team reacted instantly. They stormed his position, knocked it out, only for the Belgians to man it again minutes later. A second attack silenced the guns for good. Explosives left nothing but debris. The plan assumed a 60-minute window of surprise, with the first 10 minutes being absolutely critical. And within that short span, fewer than 60 men from Granite assaulted and neutralized multiple objectives, both in the northern and southern ends of the fort. In the absence of Witzig, leadership fell to Lieutenant Deliker, who commanded the southern force. The northern assault was led by Sergeant Wenzel, who would earn the name the Cupola Smasher of Eben-Emael. Everything unfolded at once. Glider 1, carrying Deliker's troop, landed right near Objective 18, a key artillery casemate with 3 75mm guns and a direct link to the fort's command center. Deliker destroyed one gun with a small charge, then placed a 50-kilo hollow charge on the roof. The detonation wrecked the entire structure. One of the fortress's vital observation posts was blind. Glider 3, remember, Glider 2 had been lost with Witzig, destroyed Objective 12, a twin 120mm gun turret. Glider 5's team hit Objective 26, but had to double back after one of its guns roared back to life. They finished the job decisively. Glider 8's team went for 2 key targets, a retractable cupola with twin 75mm guns and a nearby barracks. Both were neutralized. One of the most critical positions, Objective 24, housing a powerful rotating twin-gun turret, was considered too tough for one team, so troops from Gliders 6 and 7 combined forces. They hit the turret with explosives, damaging it just enough to stun the defenders before rushing in and smashing the barrels directly. While the south was under siege, the same scenes played out in the north. Glider 9's troop used flamethrowers to clear a fortified machine gun casemate, Objective 13, then obliterated the armored structure with a shaped charge. Glider 4's team neutralized another machine gun observation post, while Objectives 15 and 16 turned out to be dummy targets, non-functional decoys. Within 10 minutes of landing, most of the fortress's primary weapons had been neutralized. But then came the unexpected. Objective 23, a twin 75mm cupola, thought to be irrelevant, suddenly opened fire. The paratroopers took cover. Deliker quickly radioed a nearby Stuka dive bomber squadron. Ju-87s screamed in overhead, dropped their payloads, and though they didn't land a direct hit, the shock was enough to force the Belgians to retract the guns and keep them down for the rest of the battle. Just as planners had predicted, Belgian resistance began to intensify after the first hour, but by then it was too late. The job was done. The main guns were silenced, the entrances sealed. The surprise assault had succeeded. Counterattacks were limited to weak artillery fire, unable to stop the German 6th Army's advance. Still, the Germans faced delays elsewhere. Farther east, Belgian engineers had blown 3 vital bridges over the River Maas and were holding off German armor with well-placed artillery fire. 6th Army couldn't move forward until those defenses were cleared, but at Eben-Emael, the mission was complete. In just 1 hour, a handful of elite airborne troops had rewritten the rules of war. The battlefield had gained a vertical dimension, and modern special operations had been born. While Witzig's men battled atop Eben-Emael, the rest of Koch's battalion launched into action across Belgium. Altmann's Steel Group landed at Veldwezelt and captured the bridge completely intact. At Frohnhoven, Schacht's detachment, codenamed Concrete, did the same. Total surprise had been achieved, but not every objective went according to plan. At Cannes, the situation unraveled. Schechter's group, Iron, arrived only to watch helplessly as Belgian defenders blew the bridge just moments before capture. Worse still, they fought back with stubborn determination throughout the day, blocking repeated attempts by Germany's 51st Engineer Battalion to cross the canal and relieve the paratroopers at Eben-Emael. From inside the fortress itself, defenders in Blockhouse 17 raked the German assault boats with enfilading machine gun fire, making any crossing attempt costly and dangerous. At Eben-Emael, however, the operation had already achieved stunning success. Despite the loss of 2 gliders and the absence of key reserve elements, the training of the Granite Force showed its worth. Every man had been drilled to take over another's task. Flexibility had been the cornerstone of their preparation, and it paid off in those first critical daylight hours of May 10th. Still, the promised relief was slow to come. At the bridgeheads of Veldwezalt and Vroonhoven, reinforcements began arriving just 40 minutes after the initial landings. Machine gun teams dropped by parachute to bolster the thin German lines. Throughout the afternoon, the 51st Engineers managed to cross the Maas and began pushing west toward the Albert Canal. But pressure from Belgian counterattacks was increasing. The airborne force at Eben-Emael was beginning to feel the strain. Then, at 8:30, Witzig's glider finally landed. His arrival was more than symbolic. It was a vital injection of leadership. Battles often reach a breaking point when adrenaline fades and doubt creeps in. Witzig brought fresh energy, rallied his men, and immediately organized patrols to dominate the remaining Belgian positions within the fort. His presence galvanized the weary troops, keeping the garrison locked inside its shattered tunnels. Meanwhile, Belgian infantry launched multiple assaults on the northwestern edge of the fortress, but lacking proper artillery support, their attacks were beaten back by machine gun fire from the entrenched Granite Force. The one position still operational inside the fortress was Blockhouse 17, the same one that had aided in holding the bridge at Cannes. Its continued resistance prevented a clean sweep of objectives and forced German engineers to cross further north. By 7 a.m. the next morning, May 11th, relief forces finally reached Eben-Emael. Koch's mission was complete. His battalion had not only shattered a supposedly impenetrable fortress, but helped pave the way for the German war machine to roll west unimpeded. But that wasn't the end of the airborne operations in the west. While Koch's gliders descended on Belgium, hundreds of transport planes had lifted off from airfields across Westphalia. It was now the turn of the 1st Parachute Regiment, whose mission was even broader: capture vital bridges, airfields, and bypass the Peel defensive line in Holland. Their goal was to vault over Dutch fortifications and crack open the core of Fortress Holland from the inside. In coordination with the 22nd Air Landing Division, the operation began shortly after Koch's landings. Some paratroopers were tasked with securing bridges between Leiden and Rotterdam, holding them until the 9th Panzer Division and the elite Leibstandarte SS arrived. Others would seize airfields, clearing the way for the bulk of the 22nd Division to arrive by air. Captain Prager's 2nd Battalion dropped and quickly took the Moerdijk Bridge after a fierce firefight with Dutch defenders. Captain Volter's 1st Battalion, assigned to the Dordrecht Bridge, captured it before it could be destroyed, but at the cost of heavy casualties. Meanwhile, 3rd Battalion took Walhaven Airfield near Rotterdam, then secured the Maas Bridge. Later that day, reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment arrived at Walhaven, bringing anti-tank guns, flak batteries, and light artillery. The anti-tank company, led by Major Goetzel, had only formed in mid-1939 and still had no proper transport vehicles for its 3.7 centimeter guns. They had tried motorcycles, but the solution in the end was cruder: tow the guns by hand. Rumors of them using dogs or ponies persist to this day, but no solid evidence exists. On May 10th, Goetzel's unit waited at Paderborn Airfield. From their transport windows, the troops watched battle-damaged Ju-52s return from the first wave, riddled with holes and scorched by flak. The message was clear: Walhaven would not be a soft landing. Just as the second wave took off, a recall order came through. The airfield had not yet been secured. For 2 long hours they waited on the tarmac. When the all-clear finally came, they took off again into a clear blue sky. What they saw en route was unforgettable: fighters above, below, and alongside them, other Ju-52s streaming back east to pick up more troops. It was an overwhelming display of German air dominance. But the landing brought grim reality. Walhaven was still under artillery fire and came under repeated RAF air raids. As crews scrambled to unload their equipment, bombs fell again. 2 anti-tank guns were destroyed. 8 of the 32 incoming aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Nonetheless, Goetzel's men salvaged what they could, used captured Dutch vehicles as makeshift towing units, and deployed to reinforce students' headquarters in southern Rotterdam. But the battle for Holland was far from over. North of the city, elements of the 22nd Division and 2nd Regiment had failed to seize their objectives. Dutch resistance was strong, and in some cases, German transports were mistakenly dropped far from the target zones. Captain Noster's men were dropped too far from Valkenburg and Ypenburg airfields. Lieutenant von Roon's company missed Ockenburg completely and landed at the Hook of Holland. Only 1 platoon made it to the airfield. The Dutch opened up with relentless fire on the next wave of Ju-52s. Some were driven off, others crashed or burned on the runways. And with the airfields lost, the plan to capture the Dutch royal family collapsed. There was one brief success: number. 6 Company managed to seize Katwijk airfield, but Dutch counterattacks quickly overwhelmed it. The survivors fell back to Valkenburg, where they joined other beleaguered German units, holding out under constant pressure. As the fighting dragged on, the Dutch launched their final blow. On May 12th, the elite Dutch Light Division arrived from the Peel Line. Its goal was simple: wipe out the isolated airborne forces and return to the defensive front. They launched powerful, coordinated attacks, pushing German lines back and threatening the vital bridge at Moerdijk. On May 14th, General Student assembled a small battle group, 2.5 companies of Jaeger troops, 6 mountain guns, and 3 anti-tank guns. They rushed to reinforce the perimeter just as German defenders were reaching the end of their strength. As the new units arrived, they went straight into action. The guns opened fire. The Jaeger surged forward. The Dutch attacks faltered and died out as night fell. Reinforcements trickled in during the night of May 14th to 15th. The next morning, fresh Dutch forces mounted on bicycles tried again, but the Germans held. By now, the paratroopers were exhausted. Many had been fighting since May 10th, low on food, water, and ammunition. Relief could not come soon enough, and it finally did. On May 18th, armoured cars and tanks of the 18th Army rolled into the outskirts of Rotterdam. Dutch resistance began to crumble. As more and more German troops arrived, the perimeter expanded until all of southern Rotterdam was under German control. Dutch counterattacks flared, but were crushed by the Panzers and Goetzel's anti-tank guns, now repurposed as mobile artillery. Ironically, these guns saw little use against tanks, but firing high explosives, they proved decisive in close support roles. Losses had been severe. 5 of the gun commanders were killed in the short, brutal campaign. In the end, the difference between success and failure came down to execution. The 1st Regiment's operations had been remarkably successful. The 2nd Regiment's less so. Many missions failed due to poor drops by Ju-52 pilots or stronger than expected Dutch resistance. Nonetheless, Germany's airborne assault in the west, despite setbacks, changed the shape of modern warfare. The skies over Belgium and Holland were no longer empty. They were a new front, and the men who jumped from them were the vanguard of a new era. The very idea of taking an island from the sky, capturing it with gliders and paratroopers, was nothing short of revolutionary, and for Adolf Hitler it was irresistible. Crete would become the first island in history to be seized entirely by airborne assault. The mountainous Greek island, stretching over 160 miles long but just 12 to 30 miles wide, lay deep in Royal Navy waters. But the Luftwaffe had a bold answer. Fly over the sea, ignore the ships, and strike the heart of the island from above. General Kurt Student, commander of the 11th Flieger Corps, had a vision. His plan would bypass British naval superiority by launching an airborne invasion directly from Greek airfields. Fighter squadrons from the mainland would shield the lumbering transports and gliders as they crossed the Mediterranean. Crete would be attacked in two phases. First, the airborne landings, then a breakout by Germany's elite mountain troops to seize the entire island. The air troops would punch the holes and the Fallschirmjäger would finish the job. The northern coast, where Student planned his first strikes, offered narrow beaches, fertile fields, and then a sudden rise into arid, rugged mountains. Along that coastline were three small airstrips, at Malem, Canea, and Heraklion, all vital to German plans. A single road ran east to west, connecting these key locations. German intelligence portrayed the defenders as elite British and Dominion units. But in reality, most of the 25,000 Allied troops were exhausted remnants from the failed Greek campaign. Many had been evacuated without their heavy weapons. Artillery was scarce, anti-aircraft guns were few. Most tanks were outdated. Crete's original garrison had consisted of only 3 British infantry battalions. General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the defence, was forced to stretch his infantry thin, spreading them across airfields with little more than rifles and resolve. To the west, the 5th New Zealand Brigade covered Malem. The 22nd Battalion held ground around the airstrip. The 23rd and 28th Maori battalions were spread across its flanks. To their east stood an Australian brigade, and farther still, British units held Heraklion. Student, meanwhile, faced serious setbacks of his own. Time was tight. He had mere weeks to organise the assault. Worse, the experienced 22nd Air Landing Division would not be available. In its place, he received the 5th Mountain Division, a superb fighting force, but completely untrained in air transport. Then came the problem of logistics. There weren't enough planes. The airborne drop would have to be done in 2 waves, shuttled in with all the delays and risks that entailed. And finally, the runways on Crete were so short that landing the transport aircraft would be a gamble, even under perfect conditions. Despite this, Student pressed on. His plan, Operation Mercury, called for a full-scale airborne invasion, using every regiment of Fallschirmjäger and the elite assault regiment. Heavy weapons and additional troops would be shipped separately from Greece in slow-moving fishing boats called kayaks, meant to arrive after the landings to reinforce and resupply. Tactically, Student divided his forces into 3 battle groups: West, Center, and East. Battle Group West, under Colonel Meindl, would make the initial strike. It consisted mostly of the assault regiment and would land at dawn around Maleme in a mix of glider and parachute drops. Their most critical target was Point 107, a dominating hill that overlooked the airstrip. Number 4th Company was assigned this task. Success or failure at Maleme hinged on them. Battle Group Center, the main thrust of the operation, was led by General Suisman. It included 3rd Regiment, elements of the Assault Regiment, and support units, engineers, machine gunners, and anti-tank platoons. These troops would be dropped around Canea and the Akrotiri Peninsula. Their objective: capture Crete's capital, seize the harbour, and open the door for reinforcements. A follow-up wave from Sturm's 2nd Regiment would arrive in the afternoon. Battle Group East, under Brauer, would attack Heraklion. His troops, drawn from the 1st Regiment and Corps units, would also arrive in 2 waves. Their goal was to secure the eastern end of the island, including Heraklion's airfield and government buildings. One objective stood out: Canea. It was the island's nerve center, and Student intended to strike hard. German orders explicitly called for the capture of key figures: the enemy divisional commander, the mayor, the bishop, even local government officials. These individuals were to be taken hostage or used in negotiations to suppress organized resistance. In total secrecy, final preparations were made on the night of May 19th. Static lines were clipped, weapons were checked, glider troops strapped in with their rifles. Paratroopers carried only pistols. Rifles, machine guns, and explosives were loaded into containers slung under the Ju-52s. The mood was tense. Adolf Strauch of the 2nd Regiment wrote in his diary, "It is evening. Our objective is Crete. They tell us it will be easy. Our reconnaissance planes bring back comforting reports. But those of us who fought before, we know better." As dawn approached, the invasion began, At dozens of airfields, Megara, Corinth, and others, the engines of over 500 Ju-52 transports roared to life. White flares arced into the night sky, the signal to take off. But immediately, an unanticipated problem emerged. The dusty, narrow runways choked visibility. Each departing aircraft kicked up thick clouds of dust, blinding the pilots behind them. Luftwaffe officers watched in dismay as their meticulous timetables fell apart. No one had expected the dust to be this bad. Takeoffs had to be staggered. The rapid succession student had hoped for was lost. Still, one by one, the planes rose into the night. Once above the clouds of dirt, the skies cleared, and the great airborne armada took shape. As far as the eye could see, Ju-52s flew in tight formation. Escorting fighters buzzed above and beside them. Beneath, Stukas dove on known enemy positions. Ahead, the island of Crete loomed, its jagged mountain spine gleaming in the morning sun. Black smoke rose over the horizon. The Luftwaffe had already begun softening up the defenses. Inside the transports, tension built. The dispatcher checked each man's static line, tugging hard to make sure it was locked to the jump cable. Red light on the bulkhead. Get ready. Engines throttled back. The signal would come any second. As the light turned green, the signal was clear. Jump. The paratroopers moved quickly toward the open exit on the port side of the aircraft. The crew had already removed the door, and the rush of cold air poured in. The jumpmaster braced in the doorway, eyes focused just above the horizon as instructed in training. At the sound of the klaxon, he leapt, followed rapidly by the rest of the stick. With each man's departure, the Ju-52 rose slightly in the air, its load incrementally lightened. Enemy fire on the drop zone was unexpectedly light. The men landed in a rocky field with no immediate small arms or artillery fire. The only sound was the drone of the engines above. Once on the ground, the troops sprinted toward their canisters, unlocked them, retrieved their weapons, and regrouped into platoons. Only one man in the group suffered an injury, a broken thigh bone. For that particular unit, the landing had gone smoothly, but elsewhere, across the island, the story was starkly different. For the vast majority of glider and parachute troops, the landings were chaotic and deadly. Tragedy struck even before reaching Crete, most notably with the death of General Suesman, commander of Battle Group Center. His glider broke free from its tow and crashed on the island of Aegina. There were no survivors. At Malem, only limited resistance was encountered during the initial landings. Anti-aircraft guns were neutralized. The bridge over the Tavernitis was secured, and the road to Sfakia was cut. However, the most crucial objective, Point 107, the high ground overlooking the Malem airfield, remained out of reach. Number 4 Company, assigned the task, was too small to take the position alone. Until that hill was captured, Allied artillery observers could continue directing fire onto the German landing zones, putting incoming transport aircraft at extreme risk. Compounding the situation, Major General Meindl, commander of Battle Group West, was seriously wounded early in the battle. Without central leadership, the German effort to take Point 107 became fragmented. New Zealand units holding the high ground recovered from the initial shock and counterattacked along the entire front. In savage close-quarters combat, the 3rd Battalion of the German Assault Regiment was nearly annihilated. Meanwhile, the situation for Battle Group Center was deteriorating rapidly. Anti-aircraft guns around Canea and the Akrotiri Peninsula had not been silenced by the preliminary bombing, and as the Ju-52s approached in broad daylight, they came under intense and accurate fire. Forced to break formation, the aircraft dropped their paratroopers over a wide and unintended area. Some German units landed directly into Australian camps, and scattered engagements broke out across hills and villages. Though Allied accounts later described hundreds of German troops being shot mid-air, German medical reports found very few dead still in harness. Post-war studies confirmed that hitting a descending paratrooper was extremely difficult, even for experienced marksmen. The worst losses for Heydrich's 3rd Regiment occurred after the landings, as scattered units struggled to regroup under heavy pressure. The 3rd Battalion was hit particularly hard, its men reduced to isolated pockets, fighting defensively, unable to mount any serious offensive action in the first days. The German Engineer Battalion and supporting units that landed at Alicanu suffered fewer casualties on landing, but quickly came under sustained pressure from British and Dominion forces. Their objective, a nearby British camp, was never reached, and Alicanu, originally designated as a forward HQ and medical station, became a contested zone. Pre-invasion briefings had emphasized the scarcity of water on Crete. Troops were told their canteens would need to last 2 days. Orientation on the ground would be by roadways and distinct landmarks such as the masts of the Kanea radio station. Soldiers were warned to avoid house-to-house fighting in villages to conserve their limited ammunition and grenades. They were also trained to commandeer captured British vehicles for use in later exploitation phases. What they had not been prepared for was the level of resistance. Contrary to German expectations, the Allied forces on Crete, particularly the colonial units, proved to be of high morale, expert in fieldcraft, and deadly accurate in combat. Despite the early belief that British forces had been demoralized by their evacuation from mainland Greece, the defenders on Crete were anything but. British and Dominion troops, especially the New Zealanders and Australians, fought with determination and effectiveness. Of the 500 Ju-52s used in the first wave, only 7 were lost, but many returned bearing the scars of battle, riddled with bullets and shrapnel damage. British anti-aircraft defences had proven far more effective than anticipated. Small arms fire from the ground, aimed at low-flying aircraft, inflicted serious damage, but these early results led to a dangerous misconception. German command, including Student himself, believed the operation was proceeding successfully. Student was unaware that 2 of his key field commanders were out of action, Sussman dead, Meindl wounded. Believing progress was being made, he ordered the second wave into the air. This would include the remainder of Battle Group Center as well as the full strength of Battle Group East. But logistical problems continued. Dust clouds once again disrupted takeoffs. Aircraft lifted off in scattered, irregular intervals, arriving over their drop zones in disorganized groups. Worse still, the schedule had relied on the second wave following immediately behind a Stuka bombing raid. But with communications cut, sabotaged by Allied agents, there was no way to delay or cancel the airstrike. The Stukas attacked at precisely 15:15, but no transports followed. The bombing merely served to alert the defenders. Later that afternoon, hours behind schedule, the sky above Retimo and Heraklion filled with transport aircraft. But the element of surprise was gone. The British and Dominion defenders were ready. Sturm's 2nd Regiment dropped over Retimo, accompanied by artillery and machine gun companies. At Heraklion, Brower's Battle Group East, consisting primarily of 1st Regiment, began their assault. The result was catastrophic. British and Dominion troops opened fire the moment the paratroopers hit the ground, before they could even reach their weapons containers. Losses were heavy. At Retimo, the German units failed to secure the airfield. Unable to consolidate or go on the offensive, they were reduced to forming defensive perimeters, pockets of resistance hoping for relief. General Sturm was briefly captured in the chaos. Meanwhile, the situation for Battle Group East was even worse. Burkhardt's 2nd Battalion suffered devastating losses. Walter's 1st Battalion managed only to reach the airfield's eastern edge. Schultz's 3rd Battalion was halted at the western edge of Heraklion and could go no further. By the evening of the 20th of May, the picture across Crete was grim. In the east, the landings had failed outright. In the center, isolated paratrooper groups clung to life, unable to attack. Only in the west around Malem had the Germans made meaningful progress, but even there, Point 107 remained in enemy hands. Finally, after a full day of incomplete reports and broken communication, General Student received accurate updates from the island. The true situation was now clear. The success of the entire operation, the fate of the German invasion of Crete, depended entirely on securing Point 107 and holding Malemi airfield. After suffering devastating losses during the airborne assault on Crete, The German 7th Flieger Division was notably absent from the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941. While German forces surged toward Moscow, Kiev, and Leningrad, the Fallschirmjäger remained behind, focused on absorbing new recruits and rebuilding from the Balkan campaign. These fresh troops, trained in the paratrooper ethos and hardened through intensive physical preparation, were quickly forged into cohesive, battle-ready units. By late September, their return to combat was imminent. On the 24th, divisional headquarters received orders. The 7th Flieger Division was to be deployed, by battalion, to the Leningrad sector, where German forces of Army Group North had surrounded much of the city. Hitler had originally ordered that Leningrad not be taken by direct assault. Believing it better to starve the city into submission than to commit elite units to brutal street fighting, he opted for siege. However, his fluctuating decisions during the campaign would greatly benefit the Red Army. At one point, Hitler ordered a halt to the armoured advance to allow slower infantry units to catch up, granting the Soviets crucial time to reorganize and reinforce. Later, he withdrew the remaining panzer divisions to support operations further south, leaving Army Group North vulnerable to Soviet counteroffensives. It was during this volatile period that the 7th Flieger Division began arriving at the front. Deployed in fragmented elements, their role became that of rapid response crisis units. Sent wherever the front was breaking, they earned the nickname the Führer's Firemen. Because of this piecemeal deployment, the division was unable to operate as a unified force during its early actions on the Eastern Front. The 1st Detachments, 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 1st Parachute Regiment, along with the 2nd Battalion of the Assault Regiment, were flown to forward airfields under the command of the German 18th Army. The 2nd Battalion of the 1st Regiment was not included, having been designated for conversion into a training unit. At that time, the German siege lines around Leningrad were incomplete. To the south, German lines extended to Schlüsselburg on Lake Ladoga. To the north, Finnish forces had pushed through the Karelian Isthmus to the Gulf of Finland. However, 2 Soviet-held salients remained, one southwest of the city and one to the east, near the River Neva. The eastern salient, just 12 miles wide, was the scene of relentless Soviet attacks aimed at breaking through and linking up with forces inside Leningrad. Such a breakthrough would relieve the city and restore a vital rail connection. It was in response to this growing threat that the Fallschirmjäger were committed. On the night of 29th to 30th September, the 1st Regiment's battalions took over positions along the Neva, held by the 1st Infantry Division. The assault battalion was immediately thrown into battle at Petroshkino, where Soviet engineers had managed to establish a bridgehead and bring in armoured vehicles. Supported by para-machine gun crews, the battalion launched a direct assault, eventually driving the Soviets back to the river. Losses were significant, and the tenacity of the Red Army became unmistakably clear. Only a few days later, on 7th October, a renewed crisis forced the assault battalion to be redeployed to the Vyborgskaya sector. Their 3rd Parachute Regiment had just arrived and was already engaged in intense combat. The regiment's 3rd Battalion mounted attacks that narrowed the Soviet bridgehead to a few fortified pockets. As the battle widened, 2nd Battalion took up position on the right flank of 1st Regiment. By mid-October, divisional headquarters had fully established itself on the Neva. Additional Fallschirmjäger units began to arrive, including the Divisional Engineer Battalion. Number 3rd Company of the Engineers was soon in action near Sinyavino, where Soviet forces had gathered for a major offensive. Other companies were assigned to support 3rd Regiment's positions around Vyborgskaya. The dense forests of Sinyavino quickly gained a reputation among the paratroopers as a killing ground. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka, had committed 2 major forces to this area, the 55th Red Army and the Neva Operations Group, with the goal of linking up with the 54th Army attacking from the east. The focal point of the offensive was Sinyavino, and the fighting that erupted there was intense, bitter, and unrelenting. combat dragged on through the freezing autumn nights and the brief daylight hours of early winter. By mid-December, the 7th Flieger Division was finally withdrawn and returned to Germany. Though the division had held the line, its deployment in fragmented reactionary roles had taken a toll on morale. The men had been used as stopgap reinforcements rather than as a full offensive unit. Still, their efforts had stabilized the front. One example of the kind of small unit action the division was tasked with comes from No. 3rd Company of the Engineer Battalion. Attached to the 328th Infantry Regiment, this unit was ordered to silently attack Soviet trenches that had crept dangerously close to regimental headquarters. Believed to be supported by tanks, the Soviet position posed a serious threat. The engineers advanced quietly through the woods. Then, in an eruption of rifle fire and grenades, the assault began. A brief but savage fight followed. Soviet forces fell back to a strong point, which was only overcome in hand-to-hand combat. Over 80 prisoners were taken. The Germans continued their advance until they encountered enemy armor. A lone Fallschirmjäger, part of a tank hunting team, charged a T-34. He attempted to throw a grenade into the open hatch, but the Soviet commander slammed it shut just in time. The German soldier then stuffed a grenade down the barrel of the main gun and fired rifle grenades into the side armor. Finally, he placed a 3-kilogram hollow charge behind the turret. The resulting explosion ignited the tank's ammunition and the vehicle was obliterated. All around him, his comrades fought bitterly, repelling massed infantry assaults, using rifles, grenades, and entrenching tools. The engineers destroyed another Soviet tank, and despite being stretched thin, continued to plug gaps wherever the line buckled. In that single day, the 110-man company claimed over 250 enemy dead, 2 tanks destroyed, and 200 prisoners taken. The price was steep. By early November, No. 3rd Company was down to just 24 men. Other companies had suffered similar fates. One had been reduced to a single non-commissioned officer and 10 men. Another could only muster 7 NCOs and 30 men. On 16th November, No. 3rd Company was relieved by 1st Infantry Regiment and returned to Germany along with the rest of the Engineer Battalion. Though 7th Flieger Division had not been committed as a unified force, its presence on the Eastern Front had been felt. While the 1st and 3rd Regiments fought bitterly near Leningrad, the 2nd Regiment remained in reserve in Germany, but not for long. Further south, Army Group South had swept through the Ukraine in a series of stunning victories. Entire Soviet armies had been encircled. The Donets Basin, rich in industry, was under threat. But as the first signs of winter crept across the steppes, the Red Army struck back. By late November, German forces were on the defensive. Army Group South was overstretched, and reinforcements were desperately needed. The winter of 1941 to 1942 would prove to be one of the coldest and most unforgiving of the 20th century, and it struck with a brutality for which the German army was completely unprepared. The High Command of the German Armed Forces, the OKW, had been lulled into a false sense of confidence, drawn in by Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union was a decaying and unstable colossus, ready to collapse with one firm strike. That conviction, shared by many generals at the planning table, shaped the entire strategy for Operation Barbarossa. They envisioned a short campaign, a lightning war that would be won in the warmth of summer, long before the snows of Russia ever had a chance to fall. And so, they planned accordingly. There were no serious provisions made for winter equipment, no proper supply lines for cold weather uniforms, insulated boots, or frost-resistant lubricants. The German army crossed into Soviet territory in June 1941 with full confidence in a swift victory, and for a time the speed of their advance seemed to justify the gamble. Vast stretches of land were taken in mere weeks, millions of prisoners were captured, but by October the rains began, day after day of torrential downpours that turned the unsurfaced roads of the Soviet Union into impassable rivers of mud. The infamous Rasputitsa season had arrived, the Russian curse of autumn, and it stopped the German advance in its tracks. Trucks, wagons, and artillery became stuck in the clinging sludge. Even the panzer divisions designed for mobility found themselves bogged down. Unlike the Soviet T-34s, which had wide, ground-gripping tracks, the German tanks were ill-equipped for the mire. But then, as the last weeks of October passed, the ground hardened once again with the first frosts. The offensive resumed. Engines roared back to life. The final push toward Moscow began. But victory did not come. Instead, the deep cold settled in, and it brought with it a different kind of enemy, an enemy the Germans were not prepared to face, the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing, machinery seized, oil froze, artillery breech blocks locked shut, truck and tank engines had to be run constantly just to keep from freezing solid. Even the smallest mistakes could mean death, but the machines had better chances than the men. The average German soldier still wore his standard uniform, his thin boots and cloth gloves no match for the relentless cold. Frostbite spread like wildfire, turning fingers and toes black. Limbs were lost to gangrene, many were left crippled. When the scale of the suffering became clear, Joseph Goebbels offered to mobilize the full machinery of the Nazi Party to conduct a national appeal, to ask the German people to donate warm clothing for the men at the front. But the military leadership refused. They feared that such an appeal would publicly expose the magnitude of their miscalculation and damage the nation's confidence in the army, and so, to save face, they let the soldiers suffer in silence. In time, the survivors of that first Russian winter would be awarded a medal, its red ribbon worn in the same buttonhole as the Iron Cross Second Class. It was officially called the Eastern Front Medal, but among the men who earned it, it was better known by other names, the Frozen Meat Order or the Mincemeat Medal. It was a badge of suffering, not honor. Throughout that winter, the misery of the infantryman knew no end. While the Germans shivered in place, underdressed and overextended, Soviet troops, clad in thick fur coats and accustomed to the deep cold, pressed their advantage. Siberian riflemen launched wave after wave of attacks. T-34 tanks roamed with engines that never froze. Russian artillery hammered the German lines with an unending supply of shells. But still, German operations could not stop. There was no time for retreat. The army had to adapt or die, and slowly, painfully, it did. Across the vast front, isolated units fought to hold the line, sometimes with little more than determination and frostbitten fingers. In the sector along the River Meus, the paratroopers of the 7th Flieger Division, now serving as elite ground infantry, were locked in battle. The Jäger of the 2nd Regiment and the 4th Battalion of the Assault Regiment found themselves fighting wave after wave of Soviet infantry. The enemy surged forward with ferocity, crashing again and again against the German lines. Among the worst hit was Battle Group Sturm, which managed to hold its sector through sheer grit. But to the north of its position, disaster was unfolding. A breakthrough seemed inevitable. The call went out. An elite force was needed, fast. There were no reserves. Only the last uncommitted elements of the 7th Flieger Division remained. And so, in the final days of December, Battle Group Meindl was formed, named after its commanding officer, General Major Eugen Meindl. Its corps included the 1st Battalion of the Assault Regiment, the regimental headquarters of the Jäger, and a battalion from the Divisional Artillery Regiment. It was not a large force by any measure, but in those desperate days even the smallest reinforcement could be the difference between collapse and survival. In early February 1942, Battle Group Meindl arrived on the Eastern Front. They were dispatched to positions around Vyazma, east of Smolensk, an area where the Soviets had been mounting ferocious attacks. There, the German defenses were a patchwork of shattered formations, remnants of elite Waffen-SS and Luftwaffe units that had been ground down in months of fighting. What remained were fragments, scattered survivors. but they still held their positions with fanatical resolve. These broken units were gathered and folded into Meindel's group, forming a composite force held together by willpower and experience. But the pressure did not let up. As Stalin and Stavka shifted their offensive focus, the next blow fell at Yukhnov, just south of the capital. That sector was being held by the 2nd Regiment of the Fallschirmjäger. Once again, the lines buckled under the force of the Red Army's renewed assault. In response, Battle Group Meindl was pulled from Vyazma and rushed to Yukhnov. The timing was critical. Thrown into combat immediately upon arrival, Meindl's men helped halt the Soviet breakthrough. It was a close-run defense, fought in forests buried in snow, in trenches that froze solid beneath their boots, against an enemy strengthened by climate and numbers. For weeks the battle raged. Sub-zero temperatures froze flesh and steel alike. Soviet casualties mounted in the thousands, yet the attacks continued. The Fallschirmjäger, by now physically worn down and under constant threat, fought on with a singular focus: survival. At last, the attacks tapered off. The sector at Yukhnov was stabilized, but Meindel's task was not yet complete. His next destination would be the river Volkhov. What had once been a force of daring skyborne raiders had, by the winter of 1941-42, become something altogether different. No longer were the Fallschirmjäger being used for precision strikes or airborne operations. They were now a fire brigade for the crumbling front, thrown into the worst sectors where the Wehrmacht needed immediate, disciplined resistance. Their role had changed, but not by choice. On the Eastern Front, there was no romance. There were no dramatic glider landings or sudden strikes. There was only frostbite, mud, and death. The paratroopers of the 7th Flieger Division, once hailed as the sharp edge of Germany's military innovation, were now dug into trenches like every other exhausted infantryman, clutching MG-34s with frozen fingers, fending off wave after wave of Soviet assaults under blizzards and artillery. They were no longer shock troops, they were survivors. And yet, even as they were misused, their performance remained exceptional. At Yukhnov, at Vyazma, and later along the Volkhov, they fought with a resilience that belied the conditions. They held the line against elite Red Army formations, bought time for the Wehrmacht, and bore the cost in blood. But the tragedy is not just in how well they performed, it is in how cheaply they were spent. Elite formations were thrown into grinding battles not suited for their design. And over time, what had once been a precision force was worn down, repurposed, and consumed in the endless churn of the Eastern War. The Fallschirmjäger did not fall in great airborne raids in enemy territory. They froze in forests, bled in bunkers, and died in positions that should have never been theirs to hold. This was no longer the war they trained for, but it was the war they were given, and they met it with iron will.